Welcome and thank you for being here today. I'm going to show you a recipe for buffalo chickpea hot pockets. This is a combination of my recipe for hot pockets and Ella Vegan's recipe for buffalo chickpea taquitos. I have a recipe, I do not know where I originally got it, for hot pockets, usually with pizza fillings and I think it would tofu and broccoli at one point as well. So the dough I'm going to be using is going to be from that recipe, and I'm doing that just because I find it's a little bit easier. This is a recipe I'm intending to use as a snack. I stick it in the freezer, it lasts forever, and so I like that to be a hot pocket rather than a taquito because I find that I make taquitos way too big and then it ends up being an entire meal instead of a tiny little snack. So what I'm showing you here is that I ended up boiling my own chickpeas. What you want to do is take your chickpeas, soak them overnight in water, then drain that water and put in fresh water to boil. Otherwise, you will be quite gassy. You really do want to use fresh water when you boil your chickpeas or any bean in order to reduce that problem. And I think in my video I put it on medium-high heat, but you're going to want to do medium-low, otherwise it will boil over and you'll have to replace the water a lot. It'll boil too fast. This recipe, I'm replacing 1 cup of wheat flour with a cup of chickpea flour. That is dried chickpeas I'm throwing in the blender to turn into flour. I wanted to do that just so there's a little bit less carbs in it. Chickpea flour has a bit less carbs than regular wheat flour does. Off camera, I put 1 stick of butter, that's half a cup, and 2 cups of wheat flour in this bowl, in addition to the 1 cup of chickpea flour. If you're going to go all one kind of flour, just do 3 cups of flour total. You need a little bit extra for rolling. Then you're going to add 1/8 teaspoon of salt. If you don't have an 1/8 teaspoon measuring cup, then do a 1/4 teaspoon, that's probably fine. And then you're going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder. I grabbed the wrong thing in my pantry, so do not make my mistake. I don't think it makes that much of a difference. It tasted fine when I was finished. I honestly didn't notice that I made that mistake until I saw this video. So you'll be fine if you make that mistake too. Mix the dry ingredients well. You want the butter to make the dough very kind of crumbly, almost like you're making one of those graham cracker crusts. Next, you'll add 1 1/3 cup of milk. I have to make my own milk with dry milk. I don't keep it in the fridge anymore. And my measuring cup only has, it doesn't have a 1 1/3 increment, so I had to separate it. So that was 1/3 cup of milk, and then now it is 1 cup of milk. Mix everything together very thoroughly. I decided to knead the dough with my hands because I thought it would be a little more thorough. Sometimes it's just too wet if you're using a tiny little thing like a spoon. It just takes forever, so I'm attacking it with my hands. One thing I recommend if you try something like this is to try using just one hand. I like to keep one hand dry when I'm cooking or baking so that I can use it to answer the phone or the door or open the microwave or oven or whatever. And then I had to add a little bit extra flour because it was too wet, which might be because I used partially some chickpea flour. I used 1/3 chickpea flour where I would have used an entire batch of whole wheat flour normally. So add some extra flour in there if you need to, just a few tablespoons at a time so that it's not too dry. now the recipe says to cover and refrigerate for an hour. I normally use a plastic lid, and that's why I put 2 kitchen towels, just in case one was a little bit too breathable. So after an hour, it's not going to rise, but it should kind of, well, if there was baking powder in it, it would rise slightly, not much. I honestly did not even notice that until I saw the video. And I was like, wait a minute, why did I grab the wrong box? Baking powder is in a round container, and baking soda is in a rectangular one. So put some dough on your rolling surface, and then you're going to roll this out into what the recipe says should be a 12 by 20 inch rectangle. I never measure because I'm not about that, and I try to get it, if you go all the way to 1/8 inch, then you're not going to be able to get it off the counter. It's going to be very hard to maneuver the dough around the insides that you cook soon. So I tried to do it about a 1/4 inch thick, which may have not quite been the right size. So because my tripod is standing on the floor to my right, I did not have enough walking room to get around the dough, roll all of it out at once, and have you actually see the dough instead of my back. So I cut off half of it to do off camera. And now I am dividing the dough up into, I think, 8 squares / rectangles is usually what I do. But as many as you can fit is probably fine. You want to try to make them somewhat large, and maybe it's just me, but I always I tend to go a little smaller than I should on everything. When I'm rolling cookies, they're always too small, etc. This looks like 8 rectangles right now, so you might actually get double that since I cut off half the dough. And then you will just let that sit for a while after you cut it all up into squares. Here's the part of the video where Ella Vegan's recipe starts. I have used her website for multiple vegan or vegetarian recipes in the past, and I like that. I'm not vegan or vegetarian, but I try to eat that way often because of my cholesterol problems. Eating vegan or vegetarian can really lower your cholesterol if you are curious about that. So her recipe says you need to dice 2 cloves of garlic and chop 1 medium-sized onion. In recipes, anytime they ask for an onion, like a whole onion, I don't do that. I buy white onions when I cook. I don't know if anyone else cooks with white onions, but that's my favorite kind to cook with. Probably because it's just what I've been doing for 20 years. But I always make, I only cut half the onion in the recipe that calls for a whole onion. I think I might have done a whole onion once back in the day, and it was just way too much. So this onion, I will admit to you, has some mold on it, which is kind of upsetting because I just bought it like a few days before I did this video. So that paper bag is my compost bin. It's my temporary compost bin. There's the mold. I'm just going to cut it off, go a few centimeters on the outside of the mold so that you get everything that could be contaminated, whether you see it or not. And then you can compost that. Yes, that paper bag is compost. We pay for commercial compost in our building. It's a local service that we're very happy to have. In Chicago, we had a similar service, but we had to drop it off in a bin in the alley. That was $10 a month, unlimited, I guess, amounts of compost. This service now is $12, but they pick it up right at your front door, so I love it. Her recipe also says you should put 1 tablespoon of olive oil in your skillet for cooking the vegetables. I prefer using a spray when I can, just because I've found that most recipes that tell you a precise quantity of cooking oil, the recipe goes perfectly fine if you just spray the pan so that things aren't sticking to the bottom. So this saves a little bit of olive oil, which is quite expensive, to be honest. So it saves your ingredients for one thing, and then it's, I think, easier because I've got the spray and I don't have to like get a measuring spoon out and do all that and have an extra thing to clean. So a lot of times I will just spray a pan when it says to put a specific amount in there. So then we're going to put our garlic and our onions in the skillet and cook it on medium heat. I'm also dicing a green bell pepper off camera. It's supposed to be half a bell pepper. Oh, it does say 1 bell pepper. I was going to use half a bell pepper and save the other half for a different recipe, but then I kind of forgot while I was cooking and used the whole bell pepper. I think it'd be fine with half a bell pepper, which is another way I try to stretch ingredients for recipes, which is probably the main reason I only use half an onion for every recipe. To me, using a whole onion is way too much for most of my recipes, but the other reason I like doing it that way, splitting it up, is because then you have an entire ingredient for an entirely new recipe. So these vegetables should be cooked on medium heat for 3 minutes according to the recipe. I definitely did it longer. I like my onions to be a little bit softer when I'm finished cooking them.
I thought that I was the one you wanted, that's what you said. I thought that we were two of a kind, forging ahead. And now we sit in silence, looking eye to eye. We feel our body science, and we can't deny that something's sparking, electric current drawing us near. The air is charged with expectations, hopes and fears. So what do we do now? I am betting hopes and dreams aren't as fragile as they seem. So I hold on, hold on, hold on, reaching for what can't be seen, hoping when I can't believe. I will hold on. Am I a dreamer? Have I spent my life asleep? I'm a believer that we will find the love we seek. And though we have our heartaches, we will find our way. After night comes daybreak, and with the dawn of day, I am betting hopes and dreams aren't as fragile as they seem.
Her recipe says to add 2 tablespoons of plant-based milk. I used my regular milk, and just so you know, 2 tablespoons is the same as an 1/8 cup of whatever. So I did half between the line of the 4th cup and the bottom of my measuring cup here. Her recipe also calls for 1 tablespoon of balsamic vinegar, which I did not have, and I couldn't find a good substitute. I think it would just make it sweeter, which is not my goal anyway, so I just omitted it altogether. She also wants you to add 1/2 cup of tomato sauce, and all I had on hand was pasta sauce, but we did have the correct amount. So you're going to add that in and mix everything up well. Add your chickpeas. You will either have 1 can of drained chickpeas or 3/4 cup of dried chickpeas that you cooked. P.S. I was supposed to mash the chickpeas before I put them in the hot pan, so don't make that mistake. Go ahead and mash them up after you cook them or after you drain the can with a fork. And then they should be, I didn't mash them very well either because I didn't want to get burned. It doesn't honestly matter if you don't mash them. They tasted fine with the whole chickpeas, but mashing them would create more of a little bit more of a paste to it. And I think that the texture would be better for buffalo sauce because it would be able to absorb into the mashed chickpeas a little easier. Her recipe calls for 3 tablespoons of hot sauce, but it doesn't mention anything about melting it with butter, and buffalo sauce is butter melted with hot sauce. So I went ahead and melted a tiny amount of butter, what I thought might be equivalent to 3 tablespoons of hot sauce. My buffalo sauce recipe that I found online and perfected is 3¼ tablespoon of butter melted. Sometimes I just do 3 tablespoons because I don't want to have like this random amount of butter left over, plus a 1/3 cup of Frank's Red Hot sauce, and that will make a 1/2 cup of buffalo sauce. We're going to add 1 teaspoon of onion powder. Her recipe also calls for 3/4 teaspoon of brown sugar, but I was not about that. And then the garlic powder is 1/2 teaspoon. Then 1/2 teaspoon of cumin. And 1/2 teaspoon of paprika. I might have been inclined to add the brown sugar if I don't have an insulin situation and if I have brown sugar already made. But I always make my brown sugar from scratch using molasses and sugar and then a sugar substitute. Sometimes just the molasses and the sugar substitute since it's sweet enough with the molasses on its own. And I didn't want to do that for a teaspoon or whatever of it. So let's just say it's not as sweet as maybe the original would be. And then salt and pepper to taste. Her recipe also calls for chili powder to taste, but I don't have chili powder. I always use cayenne in place of chili powder in any recipe because I have cayenne and then I don't have to buy chili powder. So it's the same flavor basically, and I like having fewer ingredients in my house. And then you're going to mix everything very well. I was going to try putting the filling right on the counter, but then I realized it was going to be kind of a mess to get all the dough off. So I'm putting the dough onto a cookie sheet with parchment paper on it, and I'm using this thing called a bench scraper because the dough is pretty well stuck onto the counter. You might have a better time if you use more flour, but I think having a bench scraper is very important, especially if you're going to be rolling out tortillas or these Hot Pockets or something similar like that. The original recipe that is not Hot Pockets calls for 10 small flour tortillas or a gluten-free tortilla of your choice. Like I mentioned earlier, I prefer the Hot Pockets just because it's more of a snack size than a tortilla would be for me. And then you're going to want to make sure you just don't have any filling on the edges so that you can fold the dough over. Since there's no yeast, the dough will not stretch that much. But also since there's no baking powder in mine, maybe that's why it didn't stretch that much. So just be careful whenever you're folding the dough over. It's okay if the filling pops out on the sides or on the top. You can see maybe some of mine are a little thin in places and you can see some holes. That's not a problem. It'll still cook really great. After the filling is in, refrigerate them for 30 minutes. making the Hot Pockets, put them in the oven at 400 degrees for 15 to 20 minutes. And if you are making the taquitos, you'll be doing 410 degrees at 15 to 20 minutes as well. Alright, so they've been in the oven. They're nice and firm on the outside, the dough, and the inside is fully cooked already on the stove. So that one, I wasn't worried about that too much. So you can see how they turned out. They didn't really fall out too much, which is good. And the dough doesn't really stretch because I used some chickpea flour. But it's got a nice color. So these were definitely spicy, but I will say they weren't very buffalo-y. They're good, but it's not a buffalo chickpea hot pocket. It's more of a pizza chickpea hot pocket, I guess, because there's tomato sauce in it. And it's spicy because I put, freaking cayenne and Louisiana hot sauce in it. But I know the next time I make this, I am going to be using my buffalo sauce recipe instead of the tomato sauce. It's not wet enough. It's not buffalo-y enough. It's not spicy enough. Well, it's spicy enough, but it's just not buffalo. It's chickpea stuff that's spicy with tomato sauce in it, which kind of thickens the entire filling. Okay, folks, if you like this recipe or if you liked anything about my channel, please like the video. YouTube thinks that people who like videos or videos that are liked are good videos. So please like it, share it if you want to, subscribe if it makes you happy. It'll make me happy. And have a wonderful day. Eat all the chickpeas you can find because I really like them. They're going to be coming up on my channel a lot more. See you later, guys.